If you don't have the magic headphones, then you may not be able to hear me unless you're in the very front here. So make sure to go and get your headphones so you can follow along. For me, I've been to many of these conferences, and this is one of the best inventions for these large exhibit halls. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. We've had a lot of very good discussions throughout the Congress, but in particular today around issues of the mitigation hierarchy, achieving net positive impact or biodiversity net gain, and no net loss. And so this is actually one of the final, if not the final, presentation that we'll be having here in the Business and Nature Hub, and one of the finalizing discussions during this forum. My name is Steve Edwards. I'm with the IUCN Business and Biodiversity Program, and work a lot with the extractive sector and a lot with issues around biodiversity net gain and the mitigation hierarchy. Fortunately, you won't have to listen to me presenting today because we've brought in some great experiences from across our community of practice, and we'll be hearing about a number of cases, both applied as well as reflections of lessons learned. So really what we're looking at today is how do we start to wrap up and understand the application of the mitigation hierarchy across a variety of different sectors. We had the benefit of the session immediately before this talking a lot about renewable energy. And now we'll hear a number of presentations that are either case studies or are talking about some of the broader lessons learned over the past 10 to 15 years that we've been studying and applying the mitigation hierarchy. You'll have about 8 minutes each for your presentations. You guys get a little bit 5 each or so because you're sharing. And then after the session today, at 5 o'clock, we'll have a continued discussion here in this space about what to do about establishing sharing of lessons learned in a community of practice on net positive impact. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker today, Julia Jones. Before I give her the microphone, I do want to say a big round of applause to Julia because she's been instrumental in pulling together the series of presentations this afternoon and this morning. If not, you would just see me up here trying to make jokes at the end of a very long day, and that's not a pretty sight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. Do I have a clicker? Fantastic. So that's forward. Great. Okay, so thank you. So I'm going to be presenting a robust impact evaluation of a very high-profile set of biodiversity offsets, those associated with the Mpi mine in Madagascar. And this is still under review, and so I'd rather not share the results too publicly yet. The journal have asked us to keep it under embargo, and it's led by my PhD student, Katie Devonish. So Mpi is very well known to many of you because it's an extremely high-profile mine, slap bang in the middle of the eastern rainforests of Madagascar. It's a large nickel and cobalt mine. And of course, the biodiversity of Madagascar needs no introduction to this audience. And right from the start, Mpi positioned itself as a leader in sustainable mining. So they were a pilot project of the Business and Biodiversity Offset Partnership, which of course sets standards and best practice guidelines for applying the mitigation hierarchy with the aim of delivering no net loss or net gain. And they had a commitment to, or they have a commitment to deliver no net loss and preferably a net gain in biodiversity. So they've done this by following the mitigation hierarchy. So of course the first step is avoidance, and they did some quite dramatic avoidance. For example, moving their slurry pipeline around a site where golden mantella, critically endangered frog, were breeding. Then of course applying minimization, remediation. But the bit I'm focusing on is the offsets. So these are avoided loss offsets, and the main driver of threat in this part of Madagascar is small-scale swidden agriculture, shifting agriculture. So they are generating, their offset strategy is to generate biodiversity gains by slowing deforestation that would otherwise have occurred in an unregulated sector, swidden agriculture. So the key question is, and this is a question that's remarkably seldom answered in a robust way, is Mpi going to achieve no net loss? And in this way, I'm only able to address it no net loss of forest. This isn't all of biodiversity. So the question that our paper asks is, does the area of forest conserved through the avoided loss offset, how does that compare to the area of forest lost due to the mining operations? So we've used statistical matching to identify a counterfactual. So that's what would have happened in the absence of the conservation. So essentially we're identifying a set of pixels from the wider forested landscape that are matched in terms of the drivers of deforestation. So distance to forest, distance to road, distance to prior deforestation, agricultural suitability, those kind of things. We've done it both for separate offsets, although we can't get a match for CFAM, one of the offsets, and for the whole portfolio. And overall, we estimate that the offsets have already avoided very nearly as much forest loss as the mining operations have destroyed. So that's about 2,064 hectares. So to explain this, we'll just look at the Enkerina offset in the top left. So that's our estimate of how much forest was lost during the period from the establishment of the offset, I think Enkerina was 2012 maybe, to the end of 2019. That's our estimate of the counterfactual deforestation, how much would have been expected in the absence of the conservation based on our pixels. And then, of course, the avoided loss is the difference between those two. And if you look, well, the conservation zone had a much lower predicted rate of deforestation, so didn't save very much. But if you look at the overall, you can see the line there, the green line is how much was lost due to the mining operations, and it's very nearly there. And our estimate is that by the end of 2021, they'll be there, and that's actually sooner than their most optimistic scenario. I'm an academic. Reporting on good news stories feels very unusual to me, so it's quite a nice story, this. The bit I'm most proud of, being a nerd, is our robustness checks. So we've thrown everything at this model. When you're doing this kind of model, you have to make arbitrary decisions. What covariates do you use to predict deforestation? What statistical measure? All sorts of different decisions. So what we did was we ran 160 odd robustness checks to see whether I was expecting that we'd find completely different results with all of them. But our best guess model is here, and you can see the vast majority of the models give you essentially the same answer. There's uncertainty associated with it, of course, but it's showing a clear net loss, avoided loss. And this is a really interesting thing that we just did in response to reviewers' comments. We've compared the magnitude of Mpi offsets in terms of the avoided loss with in terms of the effect size of how much they reduce deforestation, with a recent published paper comparing 160 odd other interventions that all aim to slow deforestation. Most of them are protected areas, but there's also integrated conservation development projects, a whole bunch. And you can see that the Mpi offsets actually are pretty effective. So there's huge caveats. I haven't got much time, so I'm going to just quickly say the three caveats. First one is, of course, this isn't biodiversity, this is forest. So biodiversity is a lot more than forest. Forest is measurable in a robust and a kind of independent way. We are fully independent of the mine. They don't actually know we've done this assessment. So we weren't using any of the mine's huge amount of data they've collected on biodiversity. This is simply forest. And the other very important caveat, of course, is that effective conservation in this context, where you're slowing deforestation that's driven by small-scale farmers expanding their agricultural land, that can mean costs falling on some of the poorest people on the planet. And I've actually done a lot of work in the past, including on the Mpi offset, looking at how, looking at the potential social impacts. I'm very happy to talk more about that if I get a question later. And the final caveat is, of course, it's one that we're all familiar with. No net loss in the context of avoided loss offsets doesn't mean no loss, because you're reducing against a declining baseline. And this is something that Fabien is going to be talking about in his later presentation. So, you know, in the context of Madagascar, where there is such immediate threat of on the remaining forest, it does make sense that the focus of the offsets has been on avoiding loss, because that's the absolute priority right now. But thinking in the broader context of nature positive, etc., you know, the question is that enough? Okay, so this is an encouraging result, which is very happy for me to be presenting, because it does show that offsetting can contribute towards mitigating the environmental damage from major development, even though the context here couldn't be harder. This is an incredibly poor place, weak governance, all sorts of challenges. But the caveats can't be ignored, and that's something I can't emphasize enough. So thank you very much. Do I have time for a question?
Are there any questions more about specificity of the site and not general discussions around offsets, which we'll save time for later for another one, but specific to this case or this example? Questions? Don't be shy.
Oh, if there's no questions, then people aren't interested.
Yeah.
I'll ask a question. Do you have any data on the cost per unit area of those offsets relative to the other examples that you gave us in that comparative graph?
No. and that's the real challenge. I mean, during the period of the offsets, the management have shifted from so originally the Ankerina offset that, as I showed, has delivered most of the avoided loss. Originally the Ankerina offset was managed directly by the mine, essentially, or pretty directly. It was eventually passed on to Conservation International, who managed the whole of that wider forest landscape. And I know there were some challenges at the time of the handover because the investment per unit area was higher when it was the mine than rolled in to this wider landscape. But it's a very, very good question. I mean, I have a bit of a theory, and this is purely speculative, that companies have a very strong focus on outcomes. Everything they do is about delivery and outcomes. They're very used to setting contracts. They're very used to kind of focusing on delivery and focusing on outcomes. So my gut feeling is that when a company comes into a realm like conservation, and I have no idea whether this is has broader applicability or not, but I wonder if the very strong focus that a company has and the scrutiny they're under, etc., perhaps makes the conservation made more effective. Now, obviously, as I say, being effective in terms of conservation in this context can have downsides because it can mean social costs on local communities. But yeah, there's lots more to discuss on that.
Great, thanks so much. Any further questions? Okay, bring your hands together then, please, for Julia. Thanks so much for your presentation. Next up, we'll have Mark Johnston from BP letting us know how achievable. You've changed your title. Okay, challenges and opportunities for implementing NPI.
Always changing business. Yeah. Thank you much. Okay, thanks much. Great, thanks much, Steve. So hi, some of you will know me. I'm Mark Johnston, strategy lead for biodiversity and nature-based solutions in BP. So first of all, something's happened to the slide title. Anyway, we'll get through that. So some of you would have seen this slide before in a slightly different format. Just what we want to do, talk about a little bit of a journey we're going through in BP in terms of biodiversity. So last year we launched our new biodiversity position. We then launched a new sustainability frame, and what we're doing now is basically embedding that sustainability into our business, including our biodiversity position. But I just want to spend a little time talking through our biodiversity position, and then I'll dig into a little bit more detail, expanding on some of the things I covered this morning, if we weren't in that talk. So first of all, the biodiversity, we have an aim in our sustainability frame. It's aimed to enhance biodiversity across our operations globally. And under that, we have three specific objectives. One objective is about aiming to achieve a net positive impact on biodiversity in our new projects from 2022. It's across all projects globally, BP operated projects. It could be from seismic activities, from drilling to offshore renewables, a whole range of different types of projects. There is slight caveats to it in terms of its projects which have a potential to have a significant direct impact on biodiversity. Because in BP, at any one year, we may have 3,000 projects going on at any one time. And a lot of those are just retrofitting bits of kit, and they're not going to have a biodiversity impact. So we have put that caveat in there. The second one, we corrected the slides. Thank you very much. Objective 2 is about enhancing biodiversity around our existing operations, because we realise achieving NPI at our existing operations is virtually impossible because we don't have the baseline, we don't know what the actual impact actually has been. So we're introducing enhancement plans around those. And the third one is working at a country level about supporting conservation efforts at a country or national level. And we'll be rolling out information about that later on this year, going into next year. Against those objectives, we set specific targets. They are process targets, not outcome-based targets. Very much reflecting in terms of how sort of the way we sort of work, I suppose, in BP. They outline there all the information here and a lot more information. Challenging because projects start and stop all the time. Some projects may last for 6 months. Some projects, this is like building new sites, etc. Some of those may go on for several years, and the impacts may happen at different times. So we set an overall target by 30% of all the actions, i.e. the mitigation measures, will be delivered or being implemented within 3 years of project startup, and 90% of the actions within 5 years. Partly to try and drive action quickly, to emphasize the importance of it, but also recognizing there will be some actions that will take longer. So hence, people will ask me, why isn't it 100%? Because there's always going to be some actions that are going to take much longer to implement because of a whole range of social, political, economic issues. But that's an outline, and we'll be reporting on that every year and our progress towards that. I should emphasize, it's just slightly off the slide there, my apologies, FFI. Last year we launched a new strategic partnership with Fauna and Flora International, and we're working with them specifically at the moment on the NPI methodology and how do we embed NPI into our projects, but also more strategically about how do we achieve our aim around biodiversity within the company itself. So I'll give it, as I said, the methodology and our approach. Oh, go back one. Thank you. That one. So a little bit dive into some of the detail. We are developing the methodology now, as I mentioned with FFI. Let's just give it a bit of a snippet of it. This is all actions in addition to what we would normally do in an impact assessment in terms of environmental AA. So all the projects will need to undertake detailed baseline surveys. They need to identify the key biodiversity features which are going to be significantly impacted by the project. And then for each of those features impacted, they identify a particular target. We understand the impact and the inequity side of things. Well, what's the target above the baseline to achieve that NPI? Obviously, the engagement with local communities is very important. I'll come back to that piece in a minute. And then obviously you have to set the metrics and the monitoring process in order to achieve towards your particular target. A couple of things that also it's applying the mitigation hierarchy, and it's also about setting the baseline. We set a fixed base scenario baseline, so it's the baseline is the point just before the project is implemented, before the impacts happen, and then obviously NPI is anything above that initial baseline. So if we go to the next slide, is it me or? Thank you. Oh, sorry. Go back one. Let's go the wrong way. And one more back. Oh, have we missed? Should be one more slide. Oh, we had it a minute ago. Have we lost? There we are. Sorry, I got it into my fault. I'm in the wrong order. So, okay, what is MPI? This is how we defined it, MPI. MPI is when a negative impact on biodiversity is caused by a project outweighs the measurable outcomes taken from actions according to the mitigation hierarchy. So it's rather long definitions. So it's applying the mitigation hierarchy, rigidly applying the mitigation hierarchy to get the net gain. But that's quite a traditional definition of NPI. But what we've added to that is something which achieves socially sustainable biodiversity gains. In recognizing you can't do or won't be able to achieve, or it's very difficult to achieve biodiversity net gain unless you really engage and integrate the local needs of local communities into that whole process. So it has to be what we call socially sustainable. So if I go on to the next one, my apologies, on to the next one. That's my fault, wasn't putting in the right orders. So what we're doing now is, well, what does socially sustainable actually mean? So we are working on these are our draft. We're basically setting some criteria, some red lines. What are the things we won't be doing which have an impact on society or local communities? And we said that does include the implementation of FPIC, where appropriate in the different countries. So we want to just make sure, avoid getting it wrong in terms of conservation projects and implementation of MPI. That includes the offsets. And then we have a series of guiding principles around social, but in terms of applying projects. I won't go through details. Avoiding land or occupancy of land which may be used by local communities. We can't take away land for biodiversity if that land's going to be used by local communities. It's just going to create conflict with that local community. So the question is, well, where are we going to find the land? We'll work that one out on the site on a project by basis. So just give an indication of what we're working through. These are draft, but it just emphasises that importance of the social aspect on the biodiversity. And the last one. So just as a bit of summary on the challenges. The challenge for us is how do we make NPI methodology and approaches simple? Simple enough for our projects to actually implement, and that's what we're working through at the moment. I think our original first draft of the NPI methodology document is about 100 pages. I think we've got it down to 50. We need to sort of tighten it up and get it down to less than that, to something which is simple, to actually, how do you do NPI on a project or a particular site? Integration and consistency. One of the other challenges we're finding is how does NPI at a corporate level and at a project level then relate to environmental impact assessments? And because individual countries will have their own necessary guidance or procedures on what's needed for in terms of NPI assessment. And they all perhaps different countries will define what they mean by significant differently and what do you need to focus on. So we're coming across how do we integrate sort of NPI into the sort of national plans of that aspects. We talked a little bit about the opportunities, because I think if you do NPI well, it needs to provide the co-benefits and opportunities there for people, for water, for carbon and sustainable livelihoods. How do we embed those into the NPI piece as well, not just of the offsets but also the restoration work as well. And then measuring, reporting and site-based is relatively simple. How do we do it at a value chain? The usual question we're talking about, a little bit about NPI at site level, net positive at the value chain. That's a big step change, which is going to take time to get our head around. And the last point there at the bottom, oh, big one. That's all right. Last point in white at the bottom there, there's a lot of talk about reporting and disclosure, and I'm not saying that's not important, it is. But we really need to be focusing on companies making commitments and putting into action, and then worry about the metrics and reporting later. Because it may take us a couple of years to develop the metrics and the reporting. It's going to take at least a couple of more years after that to get it into the business systems. So that's 5-6 years down the line. We can't wait 5-6 years. We need to be taking action now. So I just want to emphasize that way. Thank you very much. It's a quick whirlwind.
Questions? Back here. Do we have another microphone, or is it not charged up?
Thank you. I wanted to ask if there was a repeat of something like. Oh.
Can you hear it with the headphones?
He needs headphones. Right. If there was a repeat of something like the Deepwater Horizon spill, do you believe you'll be able to offset something like that as a company? Of course. Can you hear me? My question is, if there was a repeat of something like the Deepwater Horizon spill, would you be able to offset something like that, do you think, in the future?
Somebody else's.
Oh, you're hearing our neighbors, maybe.
So I'm picking up somebody else over there. So sorry.
The question was if there were a repeat of the Deepwater Horizon accident, would you be able to offset that?
I can ask the regulators that one rather than ourselves. Could you offset? Well, first of all, in terms of the NPI on the offsetting side, that's been in terms of our planned activities and events. It's nothing to do with unplanned events. NPI is not related to oil spills and that side of things, partly because that sort of area of impacts from unplanned events is very heavily regulated. So we don't want to interfere with that side. Could we offset the impacts from oil spill? It depends, obviously, in terms of the level of the impact. and the speed of recovery in terms of the I think it depends on a whole number of different aspects. I haven't got the figures at hand, it's all publicly available. I've not sort of kept in touch with what's in terms of the latest recovery on the Gulf, for example, from deep water horizon, but we do know actually those natural systems have actually recovered much faster than they thought they were going to recover. There is still some residual impacts. Yes, there is obviously opportunities to offset. There is a huge restoration program going on in the Gulf of Mexico, which is absolutely fantastic. So that is operations. It's not necessarily directly linked to the actual impacts itself. But just make that distinction between NPI for projects and NPI offsets for unplanned events. Thank you. Conceptually, yes. It all depends on its scale. I think marine offsets is always going to be very difficult if you're looking at direct impacts. So in that respect, I think you may not be able to achieve an NPI target for particular features you're impacting, but you may be able to do additional conservation actions like creating marine protected areas or helping to create marine protected areas. Now, maybe that's not an offset to potentially your impacts, but it is potentially increasing the overall biodiversity within the region. So I think the marine area is much more complicated, much more difficult to deliver because of a whole range of factors in terms of particularly in relation to behavioural impacts on marine mammals, for example, and just the sort of dynamics of the ocean environment. So it's much more challenging.
Any additional questions?
Thank you. So I saw your first target. You can hear me.
I can hear you.
So I saw your first target as achieving NPI by 2022.
Yeah.
So when did you take this target? Which year?
Okay, so the NPI is aimed to achieve, so it's implementing NPI action plans in a project from 2022. So from 2020, all our projects will be required to put in plans with the aim to achieve
With
NPI.
okay.
We haven't set a target of when to achieve NPI,
Right.
because that depends on individual projects.
Right.
Because it depends when they start having the actual impacts, etc. So some projects may last for a short time, some people much longer. But what will happen is that any mitigation measures put in place at the project level then get passed through to the operations after the post-construction side of things. Yeah.
It's clear now. Thank you.
Time for one more. So, as you'll be aware, of course, some very high-profile companies adopted the idea of net positive impact, net gain, a long time ago, and then have moved away from it.
Yep.
There's one that we're both familiar with that's done that very prominently. BP is moving the other direction and have taken this very high-profile step. And of course, one of the challenges is once you say publicly we're going to achieve net positive impact, there is potentially more scrutiny on
Yep.
the companies. I'm just interested in the thinking behind the company as to why they've taken that when other companies have gone away from it.
Great question. So as it comes down to why did we take this step? And first of all, there's a lot of lessons learned from previous companies who have taken that step. And we've moved, I think, a long way in the last 5 to 10 years. And we've seen exchanged previously here about some of those lessons learned about how you do NPI. So we have a much better understanding what is actually needed there. Why did we take that step from a company? I think there's basically 3 reasons. One, because we felt it's the right thing to do. And that was actually the key message when we took this to the executives and the board. That was the key message from them. We were expecting a lot of pushback for this from the board because of the implications of doing it. But they're saying, actually, we didn't get any pushback. They're saying, should we be doing more? And I think, hang on a minute, one step at a time, because it's important, and then we're going to do it. The other aspect, of course, underlying that is, of course, our investors and shareholders are expecting us to be moving into that position, particularly because of the noise around it. And we put this in place in parallel, really, with the development of the GBF. You see a lot of things coming out in the GBF about targets, about biodiversity, and we try to basically envisage what's going on in the GBF and put that into our position as well. So I think there's 3 things really in terms of one wasn't just it's the right thing to do, it makes long-term business sense, it aligns with what investors and the rest of agencies are going on at the moment, and then what is civil society expecting us to do it. And yes, it's going to be difficult. We've agreed that we put out the aims, and then we'll work out how to get there. Because we haven't finalised the methodology yet, we're working with FFI and others. So we've still got a lot of work to do and work out exactly how we're going to do it. I mean, maybe some places where we can't do it because it's too difficult, but we just have to be open and transparent about it.
Mark, I have a question for you. How does the methodology that you're working on align with the different regulatory environments and requirements that you might have in different countries
Yep.
or from different lenders?
Yeah. So first, in terms of the regulation piece, we made it quite clear if there is existing regulations in the country for achieving MPI, the project should first really align with those. They do a gap analysis between the regulations and our assessment, and obviously if the regulations is more, then they don't follow our requirements. But obviously there's differences. If they have to do more above the regulations, then yes, they'll have to do that extra. But obviously it is changing from one country to the next. In terms of things like IFC performance standards, so our approach certainly goes beyond the IFC performance standard 6 because it's talking about NPI wherever you work. It's not just in critical habitats. And I'm hoping the actual methodology takes off some of the complications of some of the IFC performance standards and the methodology there, because I think their methodology is actually quite challenging to actually implement. So, let's just keep it simple. Project has to achieve a net positive impact. It puts in plans in place to achieve a net positive impact. That's it, essentially. You identify the key biodiversity features, just put it into action and work out what actions need to be done, and you, of course, consult with different stakeholders. Just keep it as simple as that.
Thanks. We actually have a question from the interwebs that has come in. I didn't realize we were virtual as well as presential, so hello to everybody out there, and it'll be read by Laura.
So I think this will be a very quick question. Did Mark just say that BP will be applying FPIC to all projects where NPI will be implemented?
All's always a dangerous word. I think we seek to apply FPIC where it's appropriate to apply FPIC in that regard. Yeah, and it's obviously I'm no FPIC expert, so I'll put my hand up on that one. So obviously I understand largely in terms of it's dealing with indigenous and local communities, particularly in terms of application at FPIC. We're very rarely in those sort of circumstances where we're dealing with indigenous people in terms of the level where we're actually working. But we obviously seek to apply FPIC where we can. That's always usually in discussion with obviously different stakeholders as well on how we actually apply it, because it is challenging, as we know. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Real quick question. We'll have time for questions later, but we can do one more.
Merci. Hello. Just quick question. How do you think that nature-based solution could contribute to your target to NPI?
Can you translate that for me? Right. Great question. I'm keeping them two separate. There's MBS separate from MPI because we're making investments in nature-based solutions or in natural climate solutions, we call them. So we're keeping them quite separate. There was a bit of push that saying though, by investing in investing in nature-based solutions, yes, there will be biodiversity outcomes from it. But I want to make sure the MPI side of things is quite separate. Yes, when we're investing in nature-based solutions, we should also be achieving net gains in biodiversity as well as supporting the co-benefits of local communities and water, etc. We should be doing that anyway. But internally, we're just keeping them quite separate to make sure the two are modded up. My concern is the reason why that I don't want. It sounds a bit protectionist. I have to be a bit careful what I say. I don't want the group of teams working in nature-based solutions in BP to basically swallow up the biodiversity debate. We have to be conserving and acting on biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, not just for nature-based solutions or carbon.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for the great questions. If you want to track Mark down, I know he'll be around here for a couple more hours, and he's graciously left his email address here as well, so I'm sure he'd be happy to respond to your online questions. Next up, we have a tag team from Total Energies. I don't know if Stephen, you'll go first, so we'll have Stephen Dickinson leading us off now. Thanks so much, Stephen.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, Stephen Dickinson, I'm the Group Biodiversity Lead for Total Energies, and I've got 4 minutes to give you a broad brush overview, fast track, of how we've apprehended net gain and no net loss within the company. I guess the term that summarizes that is that we've embarked on a progressive integration. That really summarizes our approach to date. to integrate those approaches into company policy. It's also fair to say that we've based that approach on embedding the mitigation hierarchy, like many companies that are, wanting to responsibly manage biodiversity, so all the way to offsetting. And also fair to say that the term NPI, I mean, it's been coined NPI in NetGain, but we were possibly doing similar activities. Maybe we're going to coin it nature positive projects now. In terms of the history we've had in terms of managing biodiversity, just an example of that is, for example, when we create safety zones around our coastal or offshore installations, those can be turned into sanctuaries for biodiversity, and in some cases went as far as being integrated into national networks of protected areas. But it can also be done at a much smaller scale. I'm thinking of a petrochemical site where we impacted an IUCN listed species. Today, through the Biodiversity Action Plan in place, we now have the biggest active breeding population of that species in France on the non-operated area of that petrochemical site. So it's those kind of things that have allowed us to build capacity. But I think, in terms of how we're integrating NPI as such and no net loss approaches, and I've got a slide here, if you could just flip to the next one. It's captured through the renewed biodiversity ambition of the company. So I don't have time, obviously, to go into the details. All this is public, but we've got a 4-piece approach, which are our objectives, and to which we report publicly back on an annual basis. It's, as I said, it's linked to the mitigation hierarchy. So having the voluntary avoidance of some sensitive areas is the basic approach. We then, what we're now able to avoid entirely, want to integrate good biodiversity management practices into our projects. And in there sits the implementation of dedicated biodiversity action plans in sensitive locations, because this is a risk-based approach. And in there we've also, in 2020, upped the commitments by integrating NPI commitment for certain of these biodiversity action plans, which are located in the more sensitive areas, to reflect that. And we've tagged an assurance piece to the NetGain or NPI. We use the terms interchangeably, but to get the NetGain verified by an independent third party, and to essentially allow for reporting and disclosure to happen further to that. We also see that this early NPI commitment will act as a deterrent or an avoidance piece for future projects to be located in those specific locations, just because of the challenge of NPI, and there's also risk for the company. So that's the second piece. The third is really revisiting our management practices at our existing sites. Oil and gas has been around for many years. We have a lot of industrial facilities that have historically been present in the landscape for a long time. And at the time, biodiversity was not so well considered and managed. So we've embarked on a pretty ambitious program to revisit our entire portfolio of key environmentally sensitive sites, which includes all our exploration production sites globally, onshore and offshore. This also includes all our refineries, all our petrochemical sites, and all our gas to power sites, which all considered as having potentially environmentally significant effects on biodiversity. So the idea is to revisit, identify the key biodiversity values, develop biodiversity action plans, which could be calibrated with specific outcomes like no net loss or net gain, or they could just go for net or nature positive approaches. The last piece I talked about yesterday is the promotion of biodiversity and biodiversity data sharing. So this is really where we stand today. This is a really candid, direct insight. We don't pretend to do much more than that, but we've set basic requirements which act as a base for continuous improvement. So we don't feel we're in a position to commit to applying a blanket approach to NPI to all our projects, for example, or to retrofitting all our existing operations with such a target. we'd rather take a very targeted and specific approach to applying NPI. But again, it's a minimum, and this is to mitigate the risk of overcommitting, which we feel today would possibly affect the trust of our senior management in us and our ability to deliver NPI outcomes. So we want to build on this, and this is the essence of this biodiversity ambition, is to set a strong foundation to cover our historical footprint, but also to prepare for the future with projects and to build on that in an incremental manner. So no blanket approach, but again, it's the basic. It does set the basic requirements that we want to apply to our company, and we can always do more today on our projects. We have a number of projects where we apply NPI which are outside of our public commitment in terms of the context, and there's also the opportunity for voluntary approaches. So that's pretty much where we're at today. It's still very early days in our NPI journey too, but yeah, it's important to keep that door open with our senior management to maintain that trust with our stakeholders too, to ensure that we can build a future that will allow us to steer towards maybe a more systematic approach on NPI or no net loss, and in particular maybe to broaden the spectrum of the context to which we apply NPI approaches. So maybe just a quick word in terms of how we operationalize and cascade this downstairs, and Claude will pick up the discussion there. It's about mainstreaming really the NPI approach into our company rules for projects in particular, but also developing guidance based on international references. I mean, we saw the Bebop example. We still feel that has a lot to offer in terms of setting the scene, in terms of key principles. It has an 8-step approach for how to implement offsets. That works, but it also allows the flexibility for locally customizing your NPI program. And of course that has to come with a dedicated training module on NPI and offsetting approaches, and building capacity also by developing our partnerships that are key, absolute key in the local implementation of NPI as such. And maybe one last comment, above and beyond NPI, I think we talked a lot about nature positive approaches, and we should think about this in terms of giving ourselves a definition, a framework and tools, because this could be a useful complement to NPI approaches, but also maybe an alternative if things just get too complicated, where we can't, like Mark was saying, we can't hold back on progress, and some companies will move at a faster rate than others, but what's important is to offer something that is pragmatic and realistic to gain momentum. There's 2 companies here today, but there's a lot that are not here that are doing things, and many more that unfortunately are not possibly doing all that they could be doing. So I'll hand over to Claude to give some more on-the-ground feedback and experience.
Thank you, Steven. Everybody hear me? That's perfect. Super. I will give you some practical feedback from my experience I faced in Mpi, in exploration and production, on the few projects we had where we implemented the mitigation hierarchy. Yesterday, Mark was saying that among environmental practitioners, we are speaking about mitigation hierarchy for almost 10 years now. And it took us in IPK, for instance, this road to really digest all what it means. Because there is a lot of common sense in the mitigation hierarchy, but there are always key challenges associated with these concepts, and they are still there. Avoidance, for example. Avoidance is a huge way to limit our direct footprint on the biodiversity. We can do it directly, like Julia mentioned about the pipeline rerouting. I was doing that in Indonesia, where we were in the mangrove in the Mahakam Delta. When we could not enter the mangrove, we were allowing our pipe below the mangrove by horizontal drilling. You can do that. Technically, it's feasible, and you don't impact the environment. And in another World Bank standard project in Yemen, we completely redesigned our marine offloading facilities. to make corals alive and maintain the flow of water within the bay we are operating. That's avoidance. And when we speak about avoiding sensitive species, everybody understands it. Everybody buys in it, and everybody commits. But when we start to speak about mitigations, implementing the reducing the impact, mitigating the impact, restoring the environment, it's becoming more complex. And one of the key questions of this part of the mitigation hierarchy is a simple question to be answered. Are our biota where we operate recoverable? Is the environment resilient? And it takes time to answer this question over the years. In Yemen, we had almost 120 species of corals. And when we started the project, we didn't know how they will react to our current activities. Which species of Porites will be more vulnerable than another one? Will Acropora survive in case of high turbidity? So it takes time, and we must admit that in some times, everyone is betting on the nature to recover. That's why it's very technically, and we need strong advice from the scientific communities. Implication of local communities is also key important in restoring the environment. You all know about mangrove restoration. It cannot be done at a company level without the support of communities. In Indonesia, we had almost a 15 years program of mangrove replanting in the Mahakam Delta, implicating all the communities. So we were restoring the degraded environment either by other stakeholders or by our operations, by implicating mangrove restoration, and we monitored it over the years. But when we come to offsetting, this is extremely complex. It's completely different situation whether you are offshore and onshore. And you have also at the company level, one key question to answer is the simple one: is there suitable land for compensation? That's sometimes very tricky to answer. And if yes, how we will be able to maintain this land over tens of years? We commit sometimes to net gain for periods over tens of years. So that's really a strong commitment. And at this point, it's really becoming very complex within the company, within our stakeholders, and within also the governments we are working with. So offsetting is usually done at a large scale, at the landscape level. So it creates also a lot of engagements with people on the ground. That puts also higher complexity. So we face big challenges in this nature positive approach wherever we are. Government buy-in, lack of competencies, sometimes lack of coordination between mandated authorities, and sometimes lack of capacity within the country. So that's really key challenges we are facing. Internally, we face also challenges. Most of big projects, when I started in the company 20 years ago, when we were saying, we start a project, I knew it will happen. Now when we say, we start a project, I don't know if it will happen. The projects now are delaying a lot of things because we are asking more and more things to be done before the FID. And sometimes because of security, we stop. And then we have to come back. So internally, it's super hard also to maintain our commitments. But things are really progressing. I see really a lot of things are moving, and all of the people here are really, as a good example, things are on the good track. We know the regulations are moving forward. So, and within the company, we are still facing these challenges, but for us, it's really an opportunity for us to be nature positive and to set up like golden rules for biodiversity, because we know that we have to do that. We all know that. Increasing protection, like what we are doing in Uganda, with limiting the poaching, for instance, capacity building, awareness trainings, that's the key pillar to enhance biodiversity. We also have to recognize that we have to be advised. I'm not a specialist. I'm working with taxonomists, but we need specialized people. And yesterday I was a panelist in a session where we're speaking about taxonomy. And taxonomists are a central part in our impact assessment studies, and especially the baseline studies. And taxonomists are endangered species now. So how can I protect a species? No one knows. That's a tricky question. So we have to move forward. And to move forward, what we implement as well is to rely on, we set up external independent biodiversity committees. That's a really powerful tool. I was used to in Yemen with the help of IUCN. It helped us a lot to have a long-term view, but also to keep the feet on the ground and practically to resolve some tensions and some difficult situations. So let's be nature positive and let's keep hope for all the business, the NGOs, and we have a common work to be done all together. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Claude-Henri and Stephen. I have a question, but you've had a question already, so I'm going to see if there's any other questions before I give you the microphone, Laura, and there are none.
Thank you. So I might have missed it because I didn't have the earphones, but this is more based on what's written on there. So is the NPI commitment for areas that are high priority for conservation, and you've specified that as category 1, 2 and Ramsar sites? I was slightly confused by that because my understanding was category 1 and category 2 would be protected from development altogether. So I don't really understand what the net positive impact commitment means in that context.
As I said, we're progressing, and we want to take an approach. In French, we say approche appliquée. So the idea is to set a point where we cannot go back on minimum requirements, and this is what's translated here. Of course, we have only one project that's in that condition, and that project was taken out, back in 2012, many years ago. This is the base, we can progress from, and we know that we'll be progressing. But can you commit to net positive impact in any condition where key biodiversity values are threatened, and not be sure that you'll be able to reach that? You lose a lot of credibility in terms of preparing the future for building capacity around your ability to deliver NPI if you're putting the bar too high. And so these are seen as areas, really that translates as an avoidance piece, okay? Like I said, it's not level playing field in terms of company culture around biodiversity, so we wanted to kickstart this, and the idea is then to progress in time to, like I said, with buy-in from XCOM in our company, to progressively expand the NPI approach to a broader suite of contexts.
So it is beyond regulation then, you're saying? So these even though category 1 and category 2 might in theory not have development, in practice that's what I'm unsure about, is whether it's beyond regulation or not.
Yeah, this is a voluntary approach. Unfortunately, a lot of countries are still opening up licenses, So, but having that is a deterrent because again, like I said, the complexity of delivering NPI in the medium to long term is uncertain, and that means that is added complexity for project managers to have to deal with. So, it could lead essentially to wanting to not develop projects in those locations. But it's difficult to get that through when the host country has opened the area for that, okay? That's the whole trick. So again, and NPI is applied outside of this context on all our large capital projects, where we are having effects or potential effects on critical habitats, so we can fall back on other criteria too, okay? But again, we're setting a basis, the strong foundation where, the most sensitive has to be protected. So this is what we're doing here. At least that's our approach. Maybe it's not the best approach, but it's a way to snowball some trust and see that grow. That was the underlying idea. of this specific commitment to introduce NPI into our company. This was the first. It was done on an ad hoc basis up to now. So, yeah, we can expand and develop that in the future.
Hi there. I believe Total has recently started shipping carbon neutral gas using offsets, and obviously there's a kind of PR side to that as well. Do you hope in time to sell nature positive carbon neutral gas or something like that? And how much of this is part of a PR strategy?
I'm not necessarily the best person to answer that question, unfortunately. I think our climate team would be in a better position to answer that. So I could put you in touch with them and you could ask them and you get a much better answer than I would provide. PR it can backfire. I mean, we have a nature-based solution business unit. Their business model is clear. They want to develop that will be able to generate certifiable carbon credits. And that's pretty much what I can tell you on that front in terms of your question, yeah. I realize I'm not answering it entirely, but so if you give me your details, I'll pick up the question.
Great, thank you.
Any further questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. So my question is based on a follow-up on the countries opening up licenses for you to operate. I was thinking that these standards are for you to live above what other contextual opportunities are there. Why do you then relax your own commitment because a country has opened up licenses? Because a country can open up a license, but the communities that live close to these resources might not be in agreement, and we've seen some of these things coming up in most places. You mentioned Uganda. So how are you living above reproach? Not looking at country licenses, but community interest.
Sorry, I didn't get everything you said, but look, on that project we have, it's an IFC aligned project, and so we consider that as the highest standard that we could be applying to that project. We're using the BBOP approach for offsetting, which has a social dimension in terms of the offsetting design to reach the NPI approach. The question is, would we go for such a project in the future? This was back in 2012. Things have changed dramatically outside of the company and inside the company. So that's what I can tell you. I'm not sure if I'm answering all your questions too. I didn't. Maybe unless you want to repeat some parts that you felt I missed out.
Maybe I can. Maybe I can add that Uganda was part of the Combo project, raising the level of knowledge on mitigation hierarchy and offsets, and the regulations are now moving on in Uganda, and this helped a lot the company on the ground to have a strong discussion with all the mandated authorities, because there is an alignment on the key regulations. Social parties, as said Stephen, part of our PS IFC aligned project, so there is stronger community engagement and development program associated with them. So you can visit the website dedicated, and you will see part of the documentations available and detail of practical things going on the ground.
So just to add to that, in terms of the social facet, it's just not viable to build an NPI program without buy-in from the communities. There's also the major challenge of influx. We're next to the DRC border. This is a project that's seen as attracting a lot of wealth. They're not waiting for FID to flow in, and there are hundreds of people, thousands of people coming in that are hoping to get a job or provide services to people who've been lucky enough to get a job. So those people are putting additional pressure on the natural resources that are part of our targeted pieces that will constitute the NPI approach. So protecting forests, rivers, and so on. And the idea is to involve the community and develop community-based plans so that they can take an active role in protecting these, but get something in exchange, of course, that allows their livelihood to increase. So biodiversity is a socio-political exercise. You can't steer away from that. There's problems with biodiversity when there's people. So, but it's very hard to. I mean, people are struggling for a daily living. So in those conditions, and there's this kind of Western OECD type mindset of wanting to do offsets. It's challenging. You need to embark everyone, and leave no one behind. But it's a huge task on these capital projects. Yeah, huge task. And take years to demonstrate. So really, NPI is also trends-based. You need to demonstrate that you've given yourself the means of your ambitions, and letting a third party witness the gain generated is the way we've decided to go when we embark on net gain programs. So if we were doing net gain outside of our commitment here, we would still use a third party. In fact, that's planned. That's planned as such. We have 2 projects where this would happen, but are not located in protected areas.
In the interest of time, I know there might be more questions. Let's move on to our next presentations. Thank you so much, Stephen and Claude-Henri. Next up will be Adeline speaking to us from the Biodiversity Consultancy and giving us a little bit of a more broad-based reflection on NPI.
Hello everyone, so I'm Adeline Serres. I'm working at the Biodiversity Consultancy. So within the Biodiversity Consultancy, we have been working with companies to help them on the implementation of no net loss for over a decade. And so on this, here you can see some very nice example of projects that have provided improved incomes for biodiversity. So for example, on the first one, it's an hydro, okay. It's an hydro project who has decided to change the design of the dam to avoid some impact on biodiversity. Then you have an example of a mining company who have developed an offset, which is a community managed area. And the third photo is an example of aggregated offset, where two mining companies have been have worked together to create a new protected area. And the final example is one vulture. So there are still a lot of challenge to with no net loss and NPI. So I won't go into the details on this slide. A lot is already known by the practitioners, but here it's grouped in 3 categories. So first, the challenge with the design and the planning, and you can avoid some of that if you start early and you focus on avoidance and minimization. Then there are also a lot of challenge with the implementation. So it will be important to have some upfront commitments, to plan for funding, and to be able to adapt when some challenge will happen. There are also challenges with the institutional and contextual. And so for that, it's important for the company to acknowledge that this challenge may happen. It needs to be integrated in the planning, and they need to be prepared to adapt. So compared to 5 years ago, there are a lot of guidance and documentation that have been developed and that can help the company. So here you just have a few examples of those guidance. So for example, there are some documents to help to understand what should be the avoidance and minimization measure. There are also some guidance on to help to develop offset that will consider social outcomes also. And yeah, so for us, even if we have those very detailed challenges that I have shown previously, but there are 3 big lessons. So the first thing is about measure and the metric. So yes, when you have your measure, your mitigation measure, it will be very important to measure them. But sometimes companies spend too much time to try to have the most precise measure possible, and then you lose the big picture. So it's quite important sometimes to just zoom out and make sure that the implementation that you will plan will able to achieve this no net loss or the NPI, and that will actually help the company to get more buy-in from the stakeholders, to have better clarity, and it can actually also reduce the monitoring cost. The second thing that is quite important is the funding and governance. So it's still very difficult to develop some offset, and company will that even when companies are planning that quite well, there can be some issue with some administrative or government requirements, and in that case, the company may lose some of the buy-in from the local stakeholders. So it's really important for us to help them and to support them in that step. And the third thing is the importance of the documentation. So usually when you design your mitigation measure, you will have a lot of technical document, and then you will work with the stakeholders to make sure that they will agree on what you have planned. But this step is often less documented, and then a few years later, it may happen that stakeholder will come back and say, wait, we don't agree anymore with the measure that have been planned, and there can be some problem with the project. So it's very important also to document all those steps. So what will happen next? So we are still learning on how to apply no-net loss and NPI, and at the same time there are also the broader business and biodiversity ambition that are evolving fast. So now we speak also about being nature positive. We speak about the fact that companies need to link their commitment with some target setting approach and to link that with a societal gain, so societal goals. So that will be a lot of challenge for all these companies. We also speak about the fact that they will have to consider the value chain in addition to the site operation impact. But in the middle of that, the mitigation hierarchy will remain central. That will still be the main thing that we will try to apply, is how to avoid, how to reduce, and how can we compensate the residual impact. And so it's very important that all the learning that we have from 10 years of applying the no-net loss and NPI on the extractive or the renewables are taken to this sector to help them to take that and apply that in this broader ambition for biodiversity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adeline, and it's great to get some reflections back on where we've gotten to now. Are there any questions, immediate questions for Adeline? Don't be shy. You're a very inquisitive group. Julia, you're always good for one. I have one for you, Adeline. You mentioned that the importance of these challenges being addressed in the early stages, and that's going to be difficult if you don't know what those challenges are going to be. But also, could you give some examples of where that would have been a useful exercise, or it's changed things when they were addressed in the earlier stages?
Yes, sure. So, of course, to address the challenge early, you need to know them. So that means that you need to do some early screening and to be aware on what can be the main risk. And so, for example, the first example that I show on this hydro project is before the development of the project. They have done some critical habitat assessment, first critical habitat screening, then critical habitat assessment, to really understand well what is the biodiversity around the project and what they could impact with the project. And based on that, they also develop an offset feasibility, and based on project to avoid a lot of the impact that would have happened downstream of the dam.
Great, thanks so much. Do we have a cyber question?
So I hope I'm reading this correctly. No problem. How do you measure the effect of mitigation actions on potential impacts identified?
No, it's okay. So when you develop your mitigation measure, you will have also to develop a monitoring and evaluation plan, for example. So there are different things that you will have, but you will have to develop measure to make sure that those mitigation measures are applied and effective. And so, for example, you will develop some indicators that are specific to measure the status of the biodiversity, but also the different pressure that you are tackling with the mitigation measure that you have implemented. And you will also have some indicators on your specific on your mitigation measure.
Hi, Nadine McCormick with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and been working with folks in TBC as well and a number of other stakeholders trying to work out what this famous nature positive means for business and trying to dive down in a roadmap. So I'm not sure if I have a question for you that you'll be able to answer right now. I think it's something we need to work through together. But one of the things we take away from the nature positive global goal is that it's systems change at all levels of the system. So we're aiming for nature positive at a global level. There's some that say one company cannot be nature positive because of the interconnections between all, but it's about contributing to this global goal. Now, of course, there's questions of how much is enough. But the idea is, and it comes down at all different spheres of control and influence. And so control, you've got site, you've got products, you've got corporate strategy, business models, and then looking further down maybe into value chains. And so one question I have is like, well, you know, the energy sector is a really cool example to be exploring now. Think of these transitions that are going on from oil and gas into broader energies. So the business model then it starts changing. You're going away from fossil fuels, you're going into renewable energy. Well, hang on a minute. We know that renewable energy options also have impacts on biodiversity. So I think I'm just going around in my head now, I'm like, oh my goodness. So how do you, because we can't, you know, compare like for like, how do we show the benefits also from a biodiversity perspective, not just a climate perspective of going from, so yeah, I don't know. I think this is quite it's an observation. And I just think the lessons that you pulled together have been really helpful to think about how we really learn the lessons from NPI. And then as we try to get to this bigger systems change at all levels of the system, what we need to have in mind. So we thought it was complicated before, it's going to get even more complicated now. But the principle is still there that overall we're trying to get a positive impact, which means halting the loss of nature and reversing. So reducing pressures on nature and putting back more. So yeah, there's no question there. It's more like a whoa.
I just bounce back on that question or that comment. And I think Mark answered it. He showed that companies are moving towards the integration of sustainability in the business processes. So if you're changing, you know, from low carbon intensity to from high to low carbon intensity, of course, you know, that's your main leveraging action to reduce global impacts associated to your greenhouse gas emissions as such. So it's that merger, because up to now we've all suffered from having the little green guys that are a nuisance to business sitting on the outside in a siloed way, and you bring them in, you know, to deal with the PR stuff, and that's happened a lot. So, but that is changing very rapidly, and you're seeing more and more frequently. It certainly happened in our company, I believe in yours too, Mark, that the head of strategy is also now becoming head of sustainability. So that's when you're going to get that transformational change to happen. Okay.
No, absolutely. I couldn't say any better, really, but I think just want to highlight that's how things are happening in the transformation level within the company level. But I think there's also some bigger picture issues globally as we make that transition, because there are going to be trade-offs. As we hugely expand the renewables, particularly offshore wind, there's going to be big biodiversity impacts. Are those going to be impacts socially acceptable? Are we as a society going to be accepting those impacts or not? I think, and I'll always come back to some of those fundamental questions. Okay, if there's a net positive on nature, does that mean there's a negative somewhere else? We can't create space. So where is that balance? Does it mean there's a negative aspect on communities? We're saying we need 30 to 50% of land for biodiversity and nature-based solutions. So what is that going to squeeze something else? So it's those bigger pictures which I don't think we've really got a hand on yet.
Can we bring our hands together for Adeline? If you can hold your question just so we can do our next round, and we'll have a little bit of time in the end for any further questions. So thank you so much. An observation that I have, being a practitioner in the space now for quite some time, is the discussions are moving up a level in terms of the scale that we're talking about, and we're no longer talking about just operations, but rather broader perspectives, which is a good thing. And I think that will also align with Fabienne's presentation, and it's her last presentation of this series.
Yeah, thank you. I'm lucky enough to be able to start my presentation with the comment I wanted to make in response to your own. So I think it's interesting and important to note that there is a difference in using the term net positive if you're talking about a project, a corporation, a sector, or a an extent of land or sea, a landscape, a country. And what I hope is that through this presentation I can give you some insights into how to make that connection from the landscape, at least to the project. And hopefully it won't be too depressing for being the last one. Does this work, or do you have to do it? Okay. Right, so we actually already saw this. This came out earlier this year, and it highlights what net positive is supposed to mean, and the perspective that it gives us. And I wanted to make sure everyone had this in mind. This is the global goal. So it is for it's not for a corporation, it's not for a project, but that's what we collectively need to achieve. And I think, going to your comment, if the situation we're in now is this background rate of decline of biodiversity, and what we have to do is reverse that curve and go upwards, well, different entities can probably play or contribute to that shift. And a lot of the offsetting from corporates today has been trying to move that curve upwards, and I'll show you how averted loss offsets, such as the ones that Julia presented at the beginning of the session, are doing that. But of course, that's not enough. You're not reversing the curve yet. You need to actually get into that net positive space that many people at the Congress this week have actually talked about and made commitments towards, so that's really good. And if it's not enough, and it's likely to not be enough to require that the private sector or that business do this, there is also, of course, plenty of space for public actors to also take on part of that burden, if I may say so, of making. The reality, of course, is what we're actually doing today in practice, in the real world, has absolutely nothing to do with that. This is a nice little schematic from a French NGO that I translated for you, and so you can see a mayor from a French town who is very proud to say that he's committing to preserving from construction or conserving 2/3 of the land in his municipality, and so he's really proud of doing that. And then there's an election comes, the next mayor makes the same commitment, and so on and so on. And of course, as you can see in the background, 2/3 of a decreasing amount of land is a net loss. It's just that we don't have the memory, perhaps, to take that into account. And we're getting this same kind of net loss outcome when we simply implement a protection of some of the remaining habitat that we have, and that we use that to offset our impact. Some of you may have seen this diagram before, I'm sorry, but for others, I hope it'll be enlightening. So if you imagine a landscape, a piece of the earth, not a corporation, that has natural habitat, you allow some new development in this habitat, and you accept this development on the condition that an offset is put in place, which means protecting some of the remaining habitat that you already had and that you didn't harm, but you want it protected. And you're ticking a big box here in terms of CDB targets, in terms of the area of your land that's under protection. But if you do this on and on, project after project, what you end up with is a net loss of that natural habitat. And clearly here, the 2-to-1 ratio, you have 2 squares of offsets for 1 square of development, actually means that over time you're going to be losing 1/3 of the original habitat that you had. And so what this lays out is that you actually can't achieve no net loss or even a net gain if you're simply protecting existing habitat. What it also suggests is that if you can think about this in reverse and start from the landscape that you want, start from your quantitative biodiversity targets in the landscape, and if your target is to develop 1/3 of that habitat for whatever reasons, then knowing that allows you to determine how much offsets you should require from each and every development project in that landscape. The alternative to simply protecting existing biodiversity, of course, is to restore degraded biodiversity, and there's plenty of that around. There's several ways of doing that. I won't go into the detail, but it's through restoration or enhancement that you can actually achieve no net loss or net gains. And so if you imagine a similar situation, but with half of the area already degraded, you can allow some development in the natural habitat. For example, if you're in Madagascar and the minerals are under some of the remaining forest and you still want to proceed with that project, you could require that the offsets be undertaken through restoration. And this here, if the restoration works, and there's plenty of caveats to that, achieve no net loss. And if you increase the amount of restoration you require for a unit of loss, then you can demonstrate net gain. Now, of course, restoration isn't always possible, and we know that this is something very important to consider. It's also important in this case to acknowledge that if restoration is impossible, then no net loss and net gain are impossible too. And so it means that we have to manage the decision or make the decision to lose some of that irreplaceable biodiversity in the knowledge that we're not going to restore it and manage it as a non-renewable resource. Again, the final outcome that you are trying to achieve determines how much offsetting you require for each project, as long as you apply that rule consistently across all of your development in that landscape. And so that's the approach that we suggest using to guide how developers, how projects, how companies can think about how they should design and size their offsets so that they can actually contribute to achieving those landscape level goals. And so this is the approach that we've been pushing, and which provides some technical and operational solutions to companies who need to justify their interpretation in a particular landscape of what NPI means. And rather than having that decided as an arbitrary increase relative to a no net loss, it could be a net positive contribution to achieving a biodiversity target. What this then implies in practice, of course, is that in all cases you're going to want to protect your offsets. Averted loss offsets and restoration offsets entail long-term protection. I think this is something that mustn't be overlooked. And if you're just doing maintenance, we've done the math to help you calculate based on the gap between your target and the current situation to calculate what area ratio you should use. And there's a different calculation if what you need to do is improve and then protect. I'll finish quickly with some of the overall challenges and advantages of this approach. It's been discussed, and it came up from a collaboration funded under the Science for Nature and People Partnership with several, actually, of the people who are in this room today. We hope to continue pushing this approach and testing how it could be applied in practice. Of course, more work needs to be done to factor in time dimensions, uncertainties, the fact that many sources of biodiversity loss in the landscapes are actually not regulated or not subject to the mitigation hierarchy and net outcome approaches, and so we need to factor in their role and who has to offset those impacts. It can be business in some cases, maybe it should come from the public purse, but this approach makes it more transparent as to who is offsetting the overall loss in the landscape. And I think I'll stop here. I think that was it. Yes, thank you. I don't have the...
Before I open it up, thank you very much, Fabian. Before I open up for questions, I just wanted to give a couple of overall reflections because then I won't be desperately waiting for my chance to give my intervention because I was tasked to do that. But some of the things that I've seen from these 4 or 5 presentations that we've had so far this afternoon, as well as the numerous discussions that have been occurring over this Congress over the past several days, is that there are many more examples now. There's more clarity in terms of what is NPI and biodiversity net gain. There are more NPI commitments, which is welcome. And there's a change in terms of the scale of need and ambition that we're looking at. And this is one of the first time in these broader discussions that there is a confluence of the discussions around the project level of NPI, as well as kind of the global scales and the nature positive discussions. And I think that that's healthy as well as necessary. We do face some real challenges and some real strong questions. The point was raised about we're running out of things to offset, right? And it's going to get harder and harder to offset. And so does that mean then that we're going to avoid and that we're going to stop developing and stop impacting? And I'm not quite sure we're ready to respond to that question, but we better get started because we're running out of options as we move forward. And there is also, though, related to that, a broader desire to feed into these targets at a global scale, and we've seen the efforts at bending the curve and moving at a global level towards more nature positive and looking at jurisdictions. Again, that's healthy, but that also requires a much stronger level of governance that currently is still quite weak. But interestingly enough, there were a lot of discussions about governance at multiple scales in multiple places. We heard about governance from government, and that's actually missing in these discussions. Now this is the business hub, so presumably that might explain part of it. But there are many challenges that still remain in terms of our governmental sphere on these issues. We had some very interesting and I think honest reflections about corporate governance, internal governance, and challenges in getting messages across and convincing people. And I have to say that's a new piece that we haven't been getting in a lot of these types of meetings. So thanks for sharing and enlightening us on that. But also the role of governance with different stakeholders and communities and organizations and mutual learning. I think that those are all things that we need to remain cognizant of as this body of work moves forward. And also, very importantly, a sectoral level governance and involvement and engagement is also really critical. There were many things that we heard throughout all of this, and I won't try and summarize much more because I want to leave chances for questions from you as the audience, but I will favor, I've lost Pippa's there, but I know, Laura, when you get back to the machine, we've got somebody in Cyberland who has a question for us, please.
So Fabian, what if you are in a context where that land protected as the offset would be lost because of the transformation rate of the land context?
You mean if it's not adequately protected?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I think I'm going to ask essentially the same question as the person online, so I'll frame it. So I've got a concern that the emphasis on you cannot achieve no net loss or net gain without restoration inevitably pushes businesses, etc., away from avoided loss offsets, and they may well be the absolute best thing to do in a circumstance. Yes, theoretically, you cannot achieve any kind of net, at the larger scale net gain without restoration. But in the context like Madagascar, for example, restoration is not where to put your effort because restoration is very uncertain and forest is being lost so fast. So I think that's really reflecting the question that was being asked there.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and I'm certainly not advocating that you shouldn't, as a company in Madagascar, contribute to the protection effort of what remains of the country's forests. What we're saying here is, don't call that no net loss. It's of course you should be making that effort. Of course, you're granted a permit to clear thousands of hectares of native forest, the least you could do is, take on a significant cost and effective, as you showed, make a significant and effective contribution to the preservation effort. But it's not no net loss. So don't call it that. Call it a managed net loss of some of the remaining forest in Madagascar that the Madagascan authorities and the investors and various stakeholders have accepted as something worth it. That the benefits that Madagascar gets from that outweigh that net loss that they're accepting. And of course, the higher, the bigger the amount of protection that you get in exchange, the lower the managed net loss scenario you're actually subscribing to. And I'm saying this, so if you imagine, I told you that if you accept a 2-to-1, so you're losing a third. If you 10-to-1, you're 1/11th, and so on. The math is actually really simple. The bigger problem, of course, is that no one's making that decision. Should it be 1/3? Should it be 1/11th? Everyone is saying it should be 0, and yet these projects are going forward. And so what we're missing is an honest conversation about how we make those decisions. And so, again, to Steve's point, you can't have honest conversations if you don't have the governance set up to allow that.
Fabienne, Pippa Howard, Fauna and Flora International. Thank you for a really important presentation and, absolutely, I think, spot on. I just want to ask a question around the ecological compensation component and the whole approach that, if Martine had been here, she would have been speaking with you. And so, greetings to her from in Australia.
I'll tell her.
Yeah. But it would, the scales are really what I'd like an answer to. So, a lot of that thinking goes into jurisdictional approaches. And if you're looking at sort of an ecosystem-based approach, how can we make this meaningful at a sort of local population, local functional unit within an ecosystem? So the efforts we go to restore biodiversity or restore nature are actually incrementally contributing to the overall health and recovery. So, from my perspective, I think every little bit has to help, but we need to be doing it in a cohesive way, that we need to be contributing into a broader, whether it's ecological connectivity or just, helping to kind of join this patch of habitat with that patch of habitat. So, how important is scale, and what would your recommendation be on that?
I'm sort of hearing two separate questions there.
That's good.
One is about the actual content or the biodiversity components you're applying this to, and so you'll have noticed that I very much spoke in the abstract. But if you remember Julia's presentation, she did mention that you could do this for area of forest, and probably with some criteria that determine, some level of forest quality that you can factor in, and of course you need to make a cutoff and saying that this forest is so degraded it's no longer forest, for example. So there's lots of decisions in there to determine what it is that you're actually applying this framework to. But the fact that you're applying your framework to multiple dimensions or multiple components of biodiversity is something that we're already doing. So projects, when they do an EIA or they apply performance standards from lenders, they're already applying them to several species, several types of ecosystems. They're factoring in levels of degradation. They're nuancing their approach with connectivity. So that's already happening, and in a way, there's already a lot of expertise for doing that. It's just that information is then processed in a system that determines gains against a hypothetical scenario of continued loss. And this is where it's that framework that we hope we can get away from, so that we can actually live up to that ambition of reversing that curve. Because if we stay with that analytical framework, we're going to keep confusing ourselves that we're doing good, when in fact we're certainly doing better than worse, but we're not doing good enough. So I think that's an important issue, but it's certainly not in opposition to what I presented. And similarly, and this is what I understood perhaps was the second question, is at what spatial and temporal scale do you set those targets that you need to implement this framework? So in a way, adopting this framework also incentivizes you to get together with stakeholders or to ask governments to play their role in determining those targets. But if the governments don't do it, then perhaps entities like IUCN and certainly the broader conservation community who are writing action plans for species or ecosystems that are doing red list of ecosystem assessments, we have all of the skills, the expertise, and probably a large part of the capacity to actually start thinking about what should be the conservation targets at different time horizons for all of these species, habitats for which we're making these action plans, and some of them are already there. In fact, recovery plans for species sometimes include population-level targets with timelines. You can anchor your whole mitigation approach and your sizing of your offsets so that your project is aligned with achieving those recovery plans. And so what we've done is we've worked out the math for you to do that. But so IUCN and the conservation community can, start putting in the recommendations in all of those species or ecosystem or habitat action plans so that the private sector can, get the rules.
Thank you very much, Fabian. We're past time. I'm sorry to tell you. I gave you the opportunity to ask questions as we were going, as opposed to loading them up at the end, so we've run out of space. The good news is you can continue having discussions around these halls or over a happy hour if you can find one. I think there will be one here, actually, so you're more than welcome to come back. I also would encourage you, if you're not already part of it, there is the Impact Mitigation and Ecological Compensation Thematic Group, which is part of the Commission on Ecosystem Management. A number of us, Fabian is
The website's there.
is a vice president or a vice chair or vice something within that. You're also welcome to ask me about it if you have more questions, and that's a great space for you to continue participating in these discussions. I really want to thank, firstly, Julia for her hard work pulling all of this together for this session and the one in the morning in the central stage, and also a real sincere round of applause and thank you to our presenters and all of you for your great questions. Thank you so much.